They laughed the moment they saw him. A 70-year-old man, grey hair neatly combed, hands calloused from a lifetime of work, stepping into a factory full of young engineers who thought they knew it all. To them, he was outdated, a burden, someone hired out of pity. They whispered, they mocked, they called him useless. But Antonio didn't come here to win applause. He came with a heart full of hope and with decades of knowledge hidden behind a humble smile. He carried his worn-out bag, his best shirt, and the determination to prove that no age can erase true talent. Before we go further, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel, because here, every story carries a twist that can change how you see life. The factory gates closed behind him. The security guard barely looked at his ID. The young engineers smirked, handing him a broom instead of a blueprint. "Your job is to keep the place clean," they sneered. And so Antonio picked up the broom with quiet dignity. But as his eyes wandered across the machines, he recognized engines he once mastered, machines that seemed to greet him like old friends. He remained silent. They thought he was invisible. They thought he was nothing. But destiny had prepared a stage where their arrogance would collapse and where this old man would rise. That night, in the silence of his small house, Antonio sat in an old armchair and stared at a dusty photograph resting on the television. In the picture, a younger version of himself smiled proudly beside a massive engine he had just brought back to life. Back then, he wasn't the man people mocked. He was the genius every factory wanted, the mechanic who could solve problems even the Germans couldn't. Memories came flooding back. He remembered the first time an international company called him to fix a production line worth millions. While engineers argued over complicated manuals, Antonio listened to the machine as if it spoke directly to him. With a few simple adjustments, he had restarted the entire line in hours. His name became known across Brazil. Directors shook his hand, newspapers praised him, and for years he lived as a legend in the world of engines. But time has a way of testing every man. His wife Helena fell ill, and doctors warned she needed constant care. Without hesitation, Antonio gave up contracts worth fortunes, sold his prosperous workshop, and abandoned his rising fame. He chose love over glory. For years he worked small jobs, driving trucks, guarding buildings, stacking boxes, anything to pay for her treatments. Helena eventually passed away, leaving him with a broken heart and an empty home. His daughter, Isabella, grew into a brilliant young woman, studying medicine in another city, carrying with her the values her father had taught: sacrifice, resilience, faith. And so Antonio remained alone, his genius forgotten, his reputation erased by time. A man once celebrated as a prodigy of mechanics, now sweeping floors in silence, but inside him the fire never died. The knowledge, the instincts, the love for engines, they were all still there, waiting for the moment destiny would demand their return. The next morning, the factory was in chaos. The roar of machines that once filled the air had been replaced by a suffocating silence. The heart of the plant, the massive million-dollar engine, had stopped. Production froze, workers gathered in anxious whispers, and every passing minute meant thousands lost. Bruno, the head engineer, barked orders into his phone, sweat dripping from his forehead. "Call the technicians, call the suppliers. We can't afford a single hour down." Around him, the young engineers flipped through thick manuals, their confidence crumbling with every failed attempt. Screens flashed warnings, alarms echoed, and yet none of their modern tools revealed the answer. Antonio, broom in hand, quietly organized tools on a nearby bench. But his experienced eyes had already seen it. The oil pattern, the faint smell, the strange cough the engine gave before dying. He knew this problem. He had solved it before. To him, it wasn't a catastrophe. It was simple. Still, he stayed silent. Who would listen to a cleaner? To them, he was invisible, a shadow sweeping dust, while their expensive machines sat lifeless. The minutes dragged on. Panic grew. If the engine didn't come back, jobs would be lost, reputations destroyed, and the factory's future thrown into darkness. And in the middle of the storm stood Antonio. the only one who truly knew how to save them. Antonio stood just a few feet away, broom in hand, watching the frantic engineers scramble around the dead engine. He saw them dismantle parts that didn't need to be touched, run diagnostics that led nowhere, and argue over theories that made no sense. Inside, his heart raced. Every detail was clear to him. The subtle leak, the rhythm of the machine before it failed, the faint vibration still echoing through its frame. He didn't need a manual or a tablet. The engine had already told him its secret. Antonio knew the exact adjustment that would bring it back to life, but he remained quiet. His pride battled with his fear. If he spoke, they would laugh again. If he offered help and failed, it would be the final humiliation. And so he swept, each stroke of the broom hiding the storm inside his chest. The young men cursed, their faces pale. "We've tried everything," one shouted. "Nothing works." Bruno's voice trembled. "If we don't fix this now, the director will have our heads." Antonio lowered his eyes, choosing silence over ridicule. The weight of knowing the answer and not being allowed to speak it was heavier than any burden he had ever carried. For the first time in years, he felt destiny knocking. But would they ever give him a chance to open the door? That night, Antonio couldn't sleep. The factory's silence still echoed in his ears. The image of desperate engineers burned into his mind. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring at an old wooden chest he hadn't opened in years. Slowly, with trembling hands, he lifted the lid. Inside lay his past. Tools polished by decades of use, instruments of precision that had once been extensions of his very soul. He picked up an aged wrench, its metal worn smooth, and felt the familiar weight settle into his palm. Memories rushed back, factories cheering when he restarted entire production lines, businessmen shaking his hand with tears of relief, young apprentices watching him in awe as he solved the unsolvable. He remembered the day German engineers called him a miracle worker. He had walked into a factory where machines worth millions had sat dead for weeks. They had manuals, computers, experts flown in from abroad. None had found the problem. Antonio, however, listened for a few hours, touched the metal, inhaled the scent of the oil, and within 2 hours, the engines roared back to life. Back then, he was not a janitor. He was not invisible. He was a man whose genius could stop or save entire industries. His name traveled across states, his reputation carved into the foundations of factories. Now sitting alone in a dimly lit room, he whispered to the photograph of his younger self, "Maybe tomorrow. Maybe it's time to remind them who I am." Long before the silence of his small home, there was laughter, warmth, and the steady presence of Helena, his wife, his anchor. She had been a teacher, gentle yet strong, the kind of woman who believed in Antonio's brilliance even when he doubted himself. Together they built a life of hope and promise, raising their daughter Isabella in a house where the hum of engines blended with love and dreams. But then came the diagnosis. Helena's condition was merciless, demanding constant care, expensive treatments, and Antonio's full devotion. The same man who once commanded factories had to make a choice no man should ever face: fame or family, fortune or love. For Antonio, the answer was simple. He sold his workshop, liquidated his contracts, and gave away the future others would have killed to possess. He turned down opportunities that could have made him rich beyond imagination. Instead, he became a driver, a porter, a warehouse worker, any job that allowed him to stay close to Helena, to hold her hand through the long nights of pain. And though the disease eventually claimed her, Antonio never regretted it, not for a single day. For love, he had surrendered everything. That sacrifice had cost him his career, his reputation, and the legacy he had once built. Yet, it also defined him more than any engine ever could. Now, years later, as he swept the factory floors, that sacrifice was invisible to those who mocked him. They saw only a fragile old man, but within him was the strength of a husband who had chosen love over glory, and that strength was waiting to be revealed once more. After Helena's passing, the silence in Antonio's home became unbearable. The laughter that once filled the rooms was gone, replaced by echoes of loneliness. His daughter Isabella, now a young woman, earned a scholarship to study medicine in another city. She called him often, her voice filled with concern, but Antonio always answered the same way. "I'm fine, my dear, focus on your future." He didn't want her to carry his burden. She had wings, and he refused to weigh them down. Yet when the phone calls ended, Antonio sat alone in the empty house, staring at photographs and tools that reminded him of the life he once lived. The world had moved on without him. The factories that once begged for his genius now hired fresh engineers with shiny diplomas. The name Antonio Silva, once spoken with respect, was now forgotten. He became just another worker blending into the background, driving trucks, unloading boxes, sweeping floors. But even in obscurity, his passion never died. On weekends, he repaired neighbors' cars, solved mechanical mysteries for small-town garages, and tinkered with engines as if they were old friends. Each time he turned a wrench, he felt alive again. Each time he solved a problem others couldn't, he was reminded of who he truly was. Still, when the day ended and the tools were put away, the weight of solitude returned. The genius of engines, the prodigy of a generation, had become a ghost in his own story. And yet fate was not finished with him. The same world that had forgotten his name was about to need it once more. The next morning, Antonio walked into the factory with his broom as usual. But instead of the rhythmic thunder of machines, he was met with a deafening silence. The massive engine, the one that powered the entire plant, had stopped cold. Workers stood in clusters, whispering nervously, while managers paced back and forth, their faces pale with fear. Bruno, the lead engineer, was red with frustration. He barked into his phone, desperate. "We can't afford this downtime. Every minute is costing us thousands." Nearby, Mateus, Gabriel, and Leonardo flipped frantically through manuals, running test after test, their confidence crumbling with each failure. Antonio didn't need manuals. He could see it in the way the oil had streaked across the floor, smell it in the air like a faint warning, hear it in the silence that followed the engine's last gasp. He knew what was wrong. It wasn't a mystery, not to him, but to the factory. He was still just the old janitor. So he swept the floor quietly, pushing dust aside while chaos grew around him. He wanted to step forward to say, "I know the answer." Yet he bit his tongue, weighed down by the memory of their laughter, their mockery. The atmosphere thickened. Phones rang endlessly. Managers shouted, workers feared for their jobs. For the first time, the young engineers looked small, boys drowning in a problem too big for them. And there, only a few steps away, stood the man who had solved bigger crises than they could imagine. The factory's future balanced on a knife's edge. And Antonio still remained in silence. By mid-afternoon, the factory was drowning in tension. Consultants had come and gone, charging fortunes and leaving only confusion behind. The younger engineers were exhausted, their faces pale, their hands trembling. Bruno sat with his head in his hands, whispering that his career was finished. Antonio, as always, was nearby, quietly arranging tools, sweeping the floor, invisible to those in charge. Yet his heart ached watching them. He could solve this in minutes, but still he held back. Then he overheard two older workers, men who had spent decades in the factory, talking near the engine. Joaquim muttered with frustration, "They spend all this money on outsiders, but never ask the ones who truly know this machine." Sebastião nodded. "You're right. Years ago, when the same problem happened, there was an old technician here. He fixed it in no time. A real master of engines. Shame he retired." Antonio's chest tightened. Their words struck like lightning. They were talking about him, about the man he once was, the forgotten savior, the mechanic who had kept the heart of the factory alive. For a moment, Antonio's eyes burned. He realized that destiny had circled back, that this was no coincidence. The machine had failed again, not just for the factory, but for him, to remind him of who he was. The voices of the veterans echoed in his soul. A real master of engines. And Antonio knew. The time for silence was over. That night, Antonio returned home carrying more than the dust of the factory on his clothes. He carried the weight of a choice. He sat before the old wooden chest once again, its surface scarred by time. Slowly, he opened it and pulled out his most trusted companions, the tools that had built his legacy. His hand wrapped around the worn wrench, the same one that had once saved entire industries. It was more than metal. It was history, memory, and proof of who he truly was. He held it tightly, feeling strength flow back into his tired arms. He looked at Helena's photograph and whispered, "I gave up my glory for love, and I'd do it again. But now it's time to rise one last time." The following morning, Antonio walked into the factory earlier than usual. The same nervous silence hung in the air, the same broken engine looming over everyone like a dead giant. The engineers were defeated, the managers restless, the workers fearful. Antonio leaned his broom against the wall and reached for the wrench inside his bag. His eyes, once tired, now burned with quiet fire. He stepped closer to the engine, not as a janitor, not as a forgotten old man, but as the master mechanic he had always been. Destiny had given him this moment, and Antonio had made his decision. He would no longer remain silent